Hello, Isaac here. So in the next few videos, I'm going to be looking at the renowned exegete, theologian and philosopher from the 1st century, Philo of Alexandria. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on two of his historical treatises. That is, Against Flaccus and his embassy to Gaius, which are principal historical sources for the political turmoil which happened in Alexandria in AD 38-41. Although Philo primarily wrote about theology and philosophy, he was part of one of the most influential families in Alexandria and is notably drawn into the political situation. In fact, in his book Special Laws, he reminisces on a time when he could devote himself entirely to study and contemplation, probably before the disasters of 38. He writes, "There was once a time when, devoting my leisure to philosophy and to the contemplation of the world and the things in it, I reaped the fruit of excellent and desirable and blessed intellectual feelings, being always living among the divine oracles and doctrines, on which I fed incessantly and insatiably to my great delight." But just after this he speaks of the violent evil lying in wait, which suddenly attacked and plunged him into the vast sea of cares of public politics, which is like an allusion to the difficulties which occurred in 38. For Philo would ultimately play a vital political role, leading a diplomatic mission to the emperor Gaius himself, in the hope that they could alleviate the violence done against the Alexandrian Jews. Josephus refers to this embassy, telling us that a tumult had arisen in Alexandria between the Jewish inhabitants and the Greeks, and that ambassadors were chosen out of each party to come to Gaius. On the Jewish side is Philo, who Josephus describes as the principal of the Jews' embassage, a man eminent on all accounts, brother to Alexander the Alabarch, and one not unskillful in philosophy, was ready to betake himself to make his defense against those accusations. And so in this video, we'll look principally at the book Against Flaccus, which records the events leading up to the Jewish persecution and the series of atrocities done against them, and the fate of the governor of Egypt, Flaccus. And so, what happened in Alexandria? Well, in the year AD 38, there was an eruption of violence perpetrated by the Greek population against the Jews in Alexandria. Philo tells us that the rioting began shortly after a visit to Alexandria by the Jewish king Agrippa I, the grandchild of the infamous Herod the Great. The Alexandrian Jews triumphantly paraded Agrippa through the city, and the sight of his bodyguard of spearmen decked in armor gilded with gold and silver stunned the Alexandrian Greeks. And in response, the Greeks congregated in the gymnasium and staged a parody of this parade, with a madman, Carabas, playing the role of the king. But what was their motive? Well, Philo notes that the Greek Egyptians had a jealous and envious disposition that saw the fortune of others as in some way affecting their own fortune, as well as an innate and ancient hatred of them. The Roman prefect Flaccus, who might have been expected to step in and keep order in his role as overseer of the city, looked the other way, and this encouraged the Greeks to continue in their mockery. As Philo writes, "When Flaccus heard, or rather when he saw this, he would have done right if he had apprehended the maniac and put him in prison, that he might not give to those who reviled him any opportunity or excuse for insulting their superiors. And if he has chastised those who dressed up for having dared both openly and disgustedly, both with words and actions, to insult a king and a friend of Caesar, and who had been honoured by the Roman Senate with imperial authority, but he not only did not punish them, but he did not think it fit even to check them, but gave complete license and impunity to all those who designed ill, and who were disposed to show their enmity and spite to the king, pretending not to see what he did not see, and not to hear what he did not hear." Following on from this, the Greeks burnt and attacked synagogues and desecrated others by setting up images of the emperor Gaius Caligula in them. Flaccus, who had previously overlooked these injustices, then partook of them as he decided to revoke the citizenship rights of the Jews. As Philo writes, he, Flaccus, proceeded onwards to another exploit, namely the utter destruction of our constitution, that when all those things to which alone our life was anchored were cut away, namely our national customs and our lawful political rights and social privileges, we might be exposed to the very extremity of calamity, without having any stay left to which we could cling for safety. For a few days afterwards, he issues a notice in which he called us all foreigners and aliens, without giving us an opportunity of being heard in our own defence, but condemning us without a trial. And what command can be more full of tyranny than this? Now, the Alexandrian Jews were granted significant and extensive privileges by Augustus in the recognition of their services and aids which the community had provided to the Romans in the preceding years. Those privileges were consistently held up by Augustus' successors and were allegedly inscribed on a bronze stela in the city. This allowed them to follow their own ancestral customs and even permitted them to send their own governing body of elders so that they could act in some sense like an independent state and send their own embassies to Rome. But the Alexandrian Jews seemed to have resented the fact that Jews had acquired these special social privileges, especially through betraying the city to the Romans in the 1st century BC. For the city of Alexandria, for 300 years after the death of Alexander the Great, had been ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, but this came to an end in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium, when Octavian, or Augustus Caesar, defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra and transformed Egypt into a province of the Roman Empire. And therefore, the governor of Egypt, Flaccus, to the approval of the Alexandrian Greeks, decided in a stroke to erase the special political status of the Jewish community. As such, the Jews were no longer equal to the Greek population and had no political rights. And the Jews celebrated their control by driving the Jews from all but a small area of the city, so that they laid claim to most of the civic spaces and facilities, and looted their homes and businesses and seized their personal property. As Philo writes, there are 5 districts in the city, named after the first 5 letters of the written alphabet. Of these, 2 are called the quarters of the Jews, because the chief portion of the Jews lives in them. There are also a few scattered Jews, but only a very few, living in some of the other districts. But what then did they do? They drove the Jews entirely out of 4 quarters and crammed them all into a very small portion of one, and by reason of their number they were dispersed over the seashore and desert places and among the tombs, deprived of all their property, while the populace, overrunning their desolate houses, turned to plunder and divided the booty among themselves as if they had obtained it in war. After the Jews had been herded into one section of the city, the leaders of the Jewish community were targeted in the most horrific manner for those of that social standing. The 38 members of the Jewish council were marched to the theatre, scourged, tortured, hanged, or even crucified amid the celebrations, as Philo tells us. But just after Flaccus had broken through every right and trampled upon every principle of justice, and had left no portion of justice and left no portion of Jews free from the extreme severity of his designing malice, in the boundlessness of his wickedness he contrived a monstrous and unprecedented attack upon them, being ever an inventor of new acts of iniquity. For he arrested 38 members of our council, which our saviour and benefactor Augustus elected to manage the affairs of the Jewish nation after the death of the king of our nation. He arrested them, I say, in their houses, and commanded them to be thrown into prison, and arranged a splendid procession to send through the middle of the marketplace a body of old men prisoners, their hands bound, some with thongs, and others with iron chains, whom he led in this plight into the theatre, a most miserable spectacle, and one wholly unsuited to the times. And then he commanded them all to stand in front of their enemies, who were sitting down, to make their disgrace more conspicuous, and ordered them all to be stripped of their clothes and scourged with stripe, in a way that only the most wicked and malefactors are usually treated. And they flogged with severity that some of them, the moment they were carried out, died of their wounds, while others were rendered so ill for a long time that their recovery was despaired of. The final measure was to attack the houses of the Jewish community under the pretense that they had storehouses of arms for a potential uprising. Philo, to point to the particularly grievous nature of this, explains the distinctive Jewish arrangement of the home. He tells us that the home is a place of seclusion for the women. The soldiers, in rampaging through the houses, terrorized these young women who had previously shunned the eyes of men out of modesty, even those of their closest relations. But they were now exposed to the public gaze, not only of someone of no relation, but of the common soldier. Therefore, in raiding the Jewish homes, they had asserted their authority even over the most private sphere denied to them. Alexandrian Jews would pour out their troubles to King Agrippa and ask him to intervene with the emperor on their behalf, as Herod Agrippa grew up in the imperial household in Rome and had become an intimate friend of Caligula. In response, Caligula decided to remove and punish the governor Flaccus. And so, during the Feast of Tabernacles between September and October 38, Caligula sent a police force to Alexandria and had Flaccus arrested and taken to Rome, and he would then be sent in exile to a Greek island. Philo tells us that when the Jews had heard of this arrest of Flaccus, there was an outpouring of praise and worship to God for relieving their suffering. He writes, "And when they heard of the arrest that had taken place, and that Flaccus was now within the toils, stretching up their hands to heaven, they sang a hymn, began a song of praise to God, who presided over all the affairs of men, saying, We are not delighted, O Master, at the punishment of our enemies, being taught by the sacred laws to submit to all the vicissitudes of human life, but we justly give thanks to Thee, who has thus had mercy and compassion upon us, and who has thus removed our continual and incessant oppressions." Philo would then go on to recall a dramatic downfall for Flaccus, which he sees as the Jewish gods' retribution for their persecution in Alexandria. First, wealth, power and prominence are all stripped from Flaccus, and he's exposed to dishonor. Philo tells that even the journey into exile retraced the route he traveled on his way to Egypt, and therefore the cities which had seen him exulting and behaving with great insolence in the hour of his prosperity might now again behold him full of dishonor. And then on the island he's exiled to, he finds himself completely alone, and he actively avoids all places where he might meet any persons on account of the shame which clung to him. In fact, he would only go out in the deepest twilight of the dawn when everyone else was in bed so that he wouldn't meet anyone. Finally, Philo tells us that one night Flaccus became possessed and realized the reason of his suffering. As he stepped outside of his cottage, he lifted up his eyes to the heavens and proclaimed to God, "O King of gods and men, you are not then indifferent to the Jewish nation, nor are the assertions which they relate to respect to your providence false, but those men who say the people has not you for their champion defender are far from correct opinion, and I am evident proof of this. For all the frantic designs which I conceived against the Jews, I now suffer myself." And so, for all the mistreatment of Jewish people, he realizes that retribution awaits him. And he says that every day, or may I say every hour, I die before my time, enduring many deaths instead of one, the last of all. Eventually, Gaius Caligula would decide that banishment was not enough of a punishment for Flaccus, as well as other magistrates and officers, since they had all the necessities of life. Therefore, he commanded that the most eminent of these men, which included Flaccus, to be put to death, and officers arrived on the island to enact this punishment. We are told that Flaccus tried to escape these officers, but that he was struck with oblique blows as he clung to the executioners and was, according to Philo, mutilated and cut about the hands and feet and head and breast and sides, so that he was mangled like a victim, and as he fell, justice righteously inflicted on his own body wounds, equal in number to the murders of the Jews whom he had unlawfully put to death. It's clear then for Philo that this punishment is just retribution for his actions, and the book ends stating that this was the end of Flaccus, who suffered thus, being made the most manifest evidence that the nation of Jews is not left destitute of the providential assistance of God. And so, with the end of Flaccus, were all the troubles of the Jews in Alexandria resolved? Well, not exactly. Once an uneasy peace had been restored, both sides appointed delegations to go to Rome. The Greeks to exculpate themselves for the disturbances and try to secure an imperial decree which kept the Jews in underprivileged position, whilst the Jews sought to redress their injuries and restore their civic rights and privileges. Philo himself led the Jewish delegation of 5. Nonetheless, Gaius Caligula posed his own problem for the Jews, not only in Alexandria, but in the symbolic heart of the Jewish people, the very temple in Jerusalem. For he looked upon himself as a god worthy of worship, and held deep suspicions towards the Jews, who refused to acknowledge this divine status. And so we shall return to this and look at Philo's next book, Embassy to Gaius, in the next video. But thank you for watching, and please make sure you subscribe, like and comment. Thank you. Bye!